Are you questioning your reality? Do you feel gaslighted? It's not you, it's the media. I am Suchitra Vajayan, and I'll be joined by Bhakti Sringarpure and Madhuri Shastri to eviscerate the propaganda, set the record straight, and offer much needed moral clarity. Tune in each week. It's not you, it's the media, a podcast by the Polis Project. Welcome to It's Not You, It's the Media, where we break down how media manipulates narratives, gaslights the public, and shapes what we think is the reality. In today's episode, we're asking why the media always gets the migration coverage wrong. From selective sympathy shown to Ukrainian refugees, to criminalization of Black and Brown immigrants, to media narratives around immigration shaped by race, class, and geopolitical interests, we're going to dive deep into what's happening across the world, but also what's happening in our own backyards in the US. We're going to talk about Haiti, we're going to talk about what's happening to Venezuelan refugees and immigrants, but also what's happening to the ways in which Palestinians have always been represented. Let's start with what's happening in New York. Madhuri, do you want to tell us what's been happening? New York is a sanctuary city, but what's been happening here since Trump's arrival?
Sure. Well, Sujitra, it doesn't feel like a sanctuary city anymore. There have been increased ICE raids. Actually, it's difficult to say whether there have been increased ICE raids because ICE has been pretty intensely operational in New York, even during the Biden administration. But there have been much more bombastic ICE raids since Trump has taken office. And notably, what happened was the Homeland Security Secretary, Kirsty Noem, joined ICE during their first raid on undocumented migrants, and she had this absolutely horrific posts on Twitter. She said, she's filmed saying it's time to get dirt bags off the street of New York, and there's these pictures of her standing like this, with her chest puffed up and whatever in front of like with the ICE team. In curls and makeup, and then there's like pictures of her on social media doing a perp walk. It
Wow.
looks like stills from the worst, most corny, cliche guns and glory movie you could possibly think of. And there was not that much outrage about this in the liberal media, even though it was one of the most horrific, heartbreaking things I've seen. And as these ICE raids have ramped up, Governor Hochul and the mayor, Eric Adams, have both said that, well, they basically towed the Republican line. They've said that these ICE raids are going to be targeting criminals, gang members, yada, yada, yada. And so we welcome these ICE raids and we're going to work with them. It's really embarrassing. It's very depressing. It's heartbreaking. There's a real palpable environment of fear, especially among, you know, the city's migrant workers or immigrant workers like street vendors and other service providers, nannies, all of these groups of people. And I think in the last week alone, the last I read, ICE had arrested about 100 people. And there were these reports of raids that had been conducted and undocumented minors being rounded up at churches, at schools in Queens and the Bronx and everything. So it has really been the site of some very grotesque, violent arrests. And of course, we know that deportation is what is in line for these immigrants who have been rounded up.
As you're saying this, I'm coming back to Suchitra's question, which is why does the media get all this sort of horrific migration coverage wrong? I mean, the word migration is not even sufficient. These are forced deportations. Those folks who were taken to Colombia with their hands zip tied, they were not allowed to use the loo on the deportation aircraft, not given water, food, just absolutely horrific stuff. And yes, we have seen some coverage of it. Yes, it's been there, but I see so much around the kind of glee of blaming people who were anti-Kamala, who were anti-Biden, who were all this shaming of, see, this is what you get, this is what you get. I mean, why is this even a line that the media needs to toe or anybody needs to discuss or throw out there? The thing that they should really remember is that Trump is now saying he's going to, spruce up Guantanamo so that all the migrants can be, the undocumented migrants can be just put there. And while this is suddenly super horrific to the media, who kept Guantanamo open? How many years did Obama have to shut down Guantanamo? I mean, Year after year, he made false promises. Then we have Kamala, then we have Biden, all these people, and they have let Guantanamo be as is. And now here it is. We get this vile guy, and he's going to use it to the best of its purpose. So I'm just really tired of this, the media's inability to really take a holistic approach and to think about migration, to think about deportations, to think about the notion of legality, illegality, documents, documentation, visas, what all of this stuff means within a historical continuum. How has it been in the US? Have we ever had a golden era of migration? There is such an ahistoricity, there is such an inability to just have a
Yeah.
wide view of what is going on, and zero humanity in the coverage. Everybody, all the references are wrong, all the terminology is wrong. I don't know why. I just they cannot humanize and historicize the coverage of migration.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to jump in and say to your point, Bhakti, I remember something you'd shared with us on the group, which is that actually statistically, the most number of deportations that have
Yeah.
occurred recently, the most number one is during the Obama presidency. The
Yeah.
second is during the Biden presidency. And the third was Trump's first tenure. So Trump is actually, and the progressives used to call Obama, deporter in chief, which he absolutely was. Like he
Mhm.
has the most number of deportations. And the media absolutely refused to cover it.
I think a big part of it is also how America views race, and there is no class analysis, right? In the racial categorization, bodies are either bodies to be exploited, bodies that are criminal, or bodies that can be expendable. I think another thing is also America has no class analysis, and this is something that I've heard progressives say for such a long time. But increasingly, when you see that there is no understanding of how class and race intersects, to talk about migration in terms of illegality, but also in terms of documented and undocumentedness, right? To get be documented in the United States is an expensive thing. My own experience of this country is my partner who's been in this country for 20 years, who for all purposes had the direct route to for citizenship, took 20 years. He arrived in this country the years after 9/11, and it took him 20 years to get citizenship. So if the legal route for someone is 20 years, and this is someone with immense privilege of caste, of class, of English language, access to resources, surrounding themselves in institutions and communities of power, this is someone with a tech background. I then imagine what happens to somebody who doesn't have any of this or has a fraction of all of this. So, to become documented is an act of immense privilege, cultural resources, and how you arrived in this country, and also what can happen to you while you are here. And as long as you have a system that is punitive, which punishes people for simply being a part of the system, then you're never going to be able to see them as fully human. And I think that is a fundamental way in which we think about migrants and immigration. And I think one of the instances that happened in New York was this woman was burnt alive in New York City subways. What was painful was not that anybody stopped to help her. People just stood and watched, including the police. It was the way the system is built not to protect her, that this is a deeply patriarchal society that thinks to do it, and it was a man who did it.
Wow.
But the story was that the person who did it was, you
An
know,
illegal immigrant.
I don't even know if we don't know his status. All we know is that he is an immigrant. The initial reports that I saw in by people who report on immigration and who I trust, I never saw what the status was. But reality, the actual conversation must have been, why is it that the New York City spends billions of dollars on the police and security, and why is it that all of this money and foot on the ground did not protect or save this woman? What kind of society do we live in which nobody came to save her or protect her? And instead, it really became about something else. And I think that is what we see the media doing all the time, is that you miss the forest for the tree, and most of the time you don't even call the tree, you call the tree, I don't know, a furniture. So I think that's really where the reporting is.
I think in general, you know, media illiteracy is so rampant around question of borders, migration, migrants, what counts as paperwork, how dehumanizing the paperwork is, how many years it takes to get it. I still remember when I first came to the US and I had the F1 visa, because I came as an undergrad, and then I continued to have an F1 visa. It had to be switched because then I went into a PhD program and then had to get a different F1 because I was in a different institution, all these things. But along the way, when I met so many Americans who had no idea how any of this happens, there would be a lot of condescension and a sort of pat on the back, like, good for you, like, our country let you in, that's so wonderful. And it's like, I have spent a gazillion dollars getting these visas, showing this much money in Indian bank accounts, doing this, doing that, the amount of blood tests, doctors tests, the tuberculosis test that always comes back positive, all this, the amount of, like, biosurveillance, the physical nature of this dehumanization, all of this stuff is lost on everyone. People think that what migrants are, that they exist under the amnesty and the savior nature of a kind umbrella state that is there to be good to them, right? And people don't even understand the various categories of migrants: the privileged ones, the economic migrants, the ones that come for jobs, the ones that take crazy perilous journeys across desert seas, so on and so forth. And I feel like, as always, journalists can take a longer view and attempt to educate the world on this kind of a thing. Years ago, when Warscapes had just started out, I had done an entire special issues called visas, because most people did not know what visas were. And I did that special issue, and then some years later, Mitt Romney was up for elections. It was the primaries or whatever, and I remember in this in the presidential debate or something, primaries debate, he was like, "Well, we welcome migrants, long as you just staple that visa to your passports, and we can go." And it's like, staple a visa to the passport? This is your solution for for migration, problems? So it's just deadly. And what kills me on top of it is the hypocrisy, because what everyone wants, so I'm very enmeshed in the world of books and publishing. Everyone wants to read good migrant literature, good immigrant literature. And guess what? If you're polished, if you're a foodie, you want to eat good migrant food, right? You want to get like Guatemalan cuisine. Oh, I will go somewhere deep in Queens and try to get myself like the most authentic version of some regional cuisine from a country, that's probably poor as hell and has all kinds of issues and has migrants and all this kind of issues. So what is, there's the fetish of the migrant on the one hand by the media, and then on the other hand, a complete illiteracy and turning a blind eye to the actual dehumanization around border policies. And of course, this is silly, the history of colonialism that leads us to this place. Why do certain migrants go to certain countries, some go to some other countries? We have to just look at old colonial maps to understand. God forbid our liberal journalists do that.
And I think another thing is also who gets to report on these stories. A few years ago, I had a student who was taking classes in a famous journalism school in New York. And the student of mine was just absolutely appalled that one of the people who came to speak to the journalism students as a guest lecturer was a New York Times journalist who was there to talk about the then the housing crisis and the the shelters, and migrants are using the shelters and how does it work. Instead of talking about the process of reporting, he really spoke about himself, and then the ways in which he was so vile in calling them illegal. It was all about how he had gone and interviewed these people and less about the people. And the student of mine was just absolutely appalled, and she was like, like, how is it that we think and allow for these men mostly, who are often seen as liberal, as good journalists who work for these legacy media. I think it's a fundamental way in which journalists or journalism schools also train people to think a certain way, We saw the Intercept's leaked memo from New York Times that said how to report on Gaza. How do you not use a language? A lot of journalists continue to use a language of illegal and legal and not documented and undocumented. I think that is very much a real issue. The other thing that you see over and over again is this repetition of the idea that we live in a paradise, that this, like, everybody wants to come here, that we are so exceptional that of course they want to come here. And also there is this devaluation of people's lived struggles. Why would someone go through a perilous journey in order to arrive here if where they started was much worse? What made that condition much worse? Probably United States and its aid. And I'm actually happy that USAID is shutting down, because I found out that USAID gives BBC $2 million a year to train black and brown journalists. And I am like, good.
No, it's awful. It's exactly those precise policies that create a crisis in the first place. I mean, we're talking, of course, about the era of decolonization and the immediate, inability for decolonization to take place because of the Cold War and weapons flooding and proxy wars and placing various dictators in this country and that. And then now we're talking about a country like the US or places like Europe, which are so industrialized, have caused the climate crisis and blame it now on everybody else. And then there's climate migration that, all these numbers climb up when it comes to thinking about the migrants fleeing floods and fleeing kind of rivers overflowing and all this kind of stuff. But who caused all this? It's like Western modern industrialization that has led us to this place.
And it's like bizarre to me that the media does not have this level of analysis and that they are so ahistorical. I mean, they don't even report what is going on as long as their guy is the guy in power. Even when they're basically abdicating their responsibility to be critical of, to be watchdogs of the state, right? So they are going to be watchdogs, the liberal media, the legacy media in the US and even in India. They're going to be watchdogs of one particular person or state, and that is the state that they consider to be an adversary. And I'm going to like even look at, for example, sort of the kids in cages narrative that we saw proliferating during or like this just intense reporting around kids in cages that we saw around the first Trump presidency, where people were rightfully up in arms. And when Trump rightfully reminded everyone who built those cages, which was actually Obama, then what happens is Biden gets elected and he has this strong moral objection to the kids in cages, and so does Kamala Harris throughout their presidential and vice presidential campaign. And what happens when they get elected? They continue the process of family separation at the southern border. And there was this very interesting report I was reading from, Hunter College, where this person says what was kids in cages then just got renamed to migrant facilities for children. And then, of course, the media calls it migrant facilities for children. Where have you seen the term cages, even though they are literally housed in cages? We are seeing this copying and absorption and regurgitation of the state's narrative. So the media doesn't even know what its role is. The media is so confused or deliberate, even. I don't even want to say they're confused. They are deliberately at not reporting on things that they are supposed to and holding a mirror in the way that they are supposed to, because of course we exist in an in a capitalist neoliberal world where they are prioritizing eyeballs and profit and blah blah blah, and it's not profitable, and it is in fact maybe boring to report on kids on cages when we have Biden in power.
I know. And I think I like the when we started chatting, you used the word allegiance. And this word is so key because I always think about people's allegiance to paperwork and these kind of lifeless documents that carry so much of our lives. I remember when I got naturalized in the US, people were like, "How did it feel? How did it feel?" I said, "It felt nothing." And then in India, you can't have dual citizenship, so I had to renounce the Indian passport, for which they charge like $300 or something like that. And then everyone's like, "Oh my god, do you feel bad renouncing the passport?" I said, "I feel nothing towards these documents." I said, "And maybe I have schooled myself to feel nothing whatever it is, I refuse to have allegiance to pieces of paper created by the state. But you have a media, you have journalists who are so in awe of a kind of paperwork, of a kind of process, and they don't understand half the time these processes are carceral. All they have within them is logics of imprisonment and detention. You don't sign one thing a particular way, it leads to this consequence. You cannot valorize paper, you cannot valorize these processes and think of them through this patriotic allegiance lens.
I really like you articulating the process as carceral, because I don't think people understand how debilitating it is. A lot of, I mean, if you are a spouse of an H-1B person in this country, for all purposes, you can't work. The capacity to work is gone. The capacity to access things are gone. Again, the idea that somehow these are not easy processes, and it's a very punitive carceral system. And I just wanted to flag something up, Bhakti, because you talked about being an old school Marxist. Is that there's a website that I usually cite, I use for teaching. It's called the refugeeproject.org. It basically visualizes publicly available data. Again, public data is far lesser. At least from 1975 to present day, we know that every single act of refugee crisis or migration in the world has happened because of the US, NATO, or Western intervention. Just like when I show this to my students, the first thing that for their first reaction is, what? Initially, the data was there for between 1975 to 2012. And today, when I was checking the website, they updated it to 2023. But same thing, every global forced migration, refugee crisis starts because the genesis is always a US, NATO, or some kind of Western intervention. Talking about India, I just felt so heartbroken when I saw those images of Indians handcuffed and sent back. It was really painful. And I was hoping that the great Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, who was so feared and beloved at the same time, or his little henchman Jai Shankar would say something, and he says, "Oh yeah, yeah, it's very." Somebody said, like somebody in a press conference says, like, "Hey, how is it okay for Indians to be, handcuffed and brought here?" Jay Shankar says, that's just normal protocol. And what's interesting is that the Colombian leaders who sent the flight back, military flight back, saying trying to migrate is not a crime and these are not criminals, and I will not receive them in a military plane with handcuffs and no access to toilets or restrooms. You send them back to my country with the respect that they deserve. Colombia stood up the United States, sent the flight back, and India is like, it's just protocol. Again, because we have to understand that India now produces one of the highest number of refugees crossing from the southern border. The Indians who are flying to the US, UK in a certain visa and overstaying. Others are spending up to 1 crore of Indian rupees to get to places in South America and make the perilous journey to the. That number has gone up quite significantly. And we again have to ask why? Why are people leaving? Why are they undertaking these journeys? Is it because where they come from is not really where life is possible, where the dignity is not possible?
It's not what the American media or Western media or even the Indian media is remotely interested in. Like, they are not interested in this. They are megaphones of the state. So they're not interested in asking these questions at all. In fact, I did see some reporting about the BBC from the BBC that said that these deportations to India is actually not a new thing. And last year, with the last fiscal year, which ends in September 2024, um, 1,000 Indians were deported to India, you know, and they had used charter planes, not military planes, but they used charter planes, and then there was no reporting on that. Like, we had no idea. Only last year did I learn that that Indians are the third largest group of undocumented immigrants now in the U.S. The media is not interested in unpacking why they are not interested. Maybe there are some human rights organizations and other watchdog agencies and NGOs that might do this reporting. The media is not interested in those reports either.
This is what we talk about all the time. There are no media jobs. Where before we used to have the crime beat, a lot of the immigration was covered by crime reporters. Like, nobody is hiring. you are hiring for all purposes either your liberal old guard or an influencer. Are not like, it takes years to become a good like reporter. It takes years to build those connections. It builds, and another thing is that I remember wanting to write about, when Midnight's Borders was being written, there is a small paragraph on Indians crossing the border, because it was in the middle of COVID. I couldn't add more details. Back then, I had put together a list. I still have that Excel sheet of lawyers and others who represent Indians who are being held in cages, who are being detained. You had lots of Indians who were going through hunger strikes. Now, a couple of years down the line, going back and going through the list, most of the lawyers are gone. Right? This is refugee law is something that has a high burn rate. It's cruel. It's a grueling. I'm not blaming these lawyers. That's not what I'm doing. All I'm saying is that the state does not provide the resources for anybody to have dignity. The media doesn't give them dignity. The legal system doesn't give them dignity. There are no resources to make sure that they actually get due process. Due requires time, money.
In that vein, I just wanted to say that, some I read some reporting out of India yesterday that said that the Indian Supreme Court has directed that, I think, between 43 or 63, I'm not sure what the exact number is, of foreigners as designated by the Foreigners Tribunal and the NRC register in Assam should be deported ASAP. And, the Supreme Court is saying, asked the government of Assam, are you waiting for like a muhurat to deport them? Like, what's going on? And the government was like, oh, well, we don't actually have any addresses for these people. We don't know where to deport them to. And the Supreme Court weaponizes the language of human rights and says, you cannot have these detainees languishing in detention centers in Assam. That's a violation of their rights. So you must deport them to the capital city of wherever they are wherever they are from, and let that country figure out what to do with them. Can you believe this spin? And this was uncritically reported by the Indian media. Speaking of exactly to your point of the lack of due process, and then the weaponizing of due process, like for due process, in order to quickly deport 63, foreigners back to Bangladesh. And I mean, for our listeners will know, many of them, that the National Register of Citizens is operational in Assam, and it's the only state in which it is operational. And the Indian government has spent money hand over fist to build multiple detention centers. I mean, they are called transit camp. There's a big detention center that is opened in Matia in Assam, where 3,000 of these detainees can be held. Government continues to spend money to build more detention centers, and we know that Amit Shah has referred to Bangladeshi migrants as termites, and he said all kinds of disgusting things. So there is money. There is money to be spent to create the carceral conditions under which the carceral framework under which immigration operates, and no money to afford due process rights or anything like that to these victims, all while weaponizing that language. And just to sort of finish my thread on India, there was also this crazy headline that I read from India today. If Trump can deport illegal Indians by the plane load, why can't the Modi government evict 63 Bangladeshis? Okay. Because these very same Indians are viewing the people who are deported back to their country as problematic. They don't even view their own people who are being deported as humans. And they think these people should be punished. I mean, you've heard a lot of liberals, I'm sure, have a very punitive attitude towards people who are economically unprivileged or caste privileged. And this is it, right? How dare you go to the US and overstay your visa? You should be deported back. Serves you right.
When I first moved to New York, there was a group of Indians that we used to socialize with, and this kind of thing about, oh, we came to this country legally. No, they didn't. Was just so casually thrown about. Even now it is. I'm not saying that it isn't. It's just that there is a certain nastiness that comes with only certain groups of people with very specific parameters can aim to have a good life.
Yes, it is that whole bootstraps narrative, right? I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. How dare you expect any privileges, and, saying that you're going to refuse to accept that maybe your ladder was a little bit more gilded than somebody else's, and instead of making it easier and breaking down the ladder and extending your arm, you want to take off some rungs so that the people after you can't climb on. And this is neoliberalism, right? It's neoliberal scarcity.
So, I mean, essentially, I think one of the things that this conversation shows us, and we know this, it's really like every country's problem, and every country, every journalist, every media in every place that has media somehow manages to cover migration badly. And I don't know what it is. Yes, this pervasive xenophobia, this extraordinary allegiance to this idea called nation. Are you American enough? Are you Indian enough? Are you French enough? Are you Italian enough? And we didn't even get to Fortress Europe, which in my mind gets covered a lot, because they were having those boats that would capsize. I mean, it still happens, but there was a phase where it was really, really bad. And European racism had been very unmasked. It's still unmasked. There are draconian policies still very much out there in Europe. And then you think, okay, that's the Western issue, that's a white issue, colonial issue. And then you think of places like India, and it's just as horrible. We're talking about CA, NRC stuff that has continues to have deep resonances. Then we are talking about Egypt, which gets all the Sudanese and the Palestinians, people we all deeply care about, and the way Egypt treats them and how horribly they treat them, and the ghettoized nature of where they are put, what they are denied, lack of any rights. So it's just such a pervasive, such an extraordinary problem. And part of me feels that if you have a privilege to be part of a media organization, if you're a journalist, it means that you've had some basic education, some time, some resources to sit down and think. Why don't you ask yourself, what is wrong with our idea of nation, that we have come to a place where we are so alienated by something that has been a human behavior from the beginning of time, moving from one place to another in search of opportunity, in search of whatever, love, new jobs, new anything, new landscapes. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be adverse, awful war conditions. I mean, that's also the reality, but it doesn't have to be like that. Why is it that we have taken something that's a human instinct, the human instinct of movement, and turned it into this awful, awful thing that needs to be contained by detention policies, imprisonment, torture, captivity? And, you know, that there is a sort of media that refuses to think about what's wrong in an overarching way with how they're thinking about this.
I have a couple of thoughts. One is that, the way that you articulated it really made me think about how internalized this xenophobia is, right? And when you have a white supremacist nation like the US and you have a Hindu supremacist nation like India, there are certain types of people who are still allowed. And there is this idea in India, for example, the people who are excluded from the Citizenship Amendment Act's rules are Muslims, whereas like Christians, Parsis, Buddhists coming from other countries aren't subject to it, And in the US, there is a certain type of refugee who is actually welcomed in, and there is a certain type of person who is not allowed. And the US, in addition to being white supremacist, has always been very aware of how to build a nation of elites. I think among that, New York is elite among elite. Everyone has some kind of eliteness, and the US is very willing to open its doors to it because the people it wants to let in, the migration that it will support and that it will facilitate, are the migrants who will keep those structures of power in place, that will reinforce the whiteness, that will reinforce their supremacy, their hegemony. And it's the same in India, it's the same with any of these countries. So it isn't a blanket like, oh, nobody is allowed to come here. It's a very pointed, you are not allowed to come here, you Muslim not allowed to come here, you rich elite caste privileged person, sure, why not, but you other undocumented Indian migrant, go back in handcuffs. And the media has very uncritically accepted this xenophobia and allows the reporting, the proliferation of these terms, as Suchitra has pointed out before, and you have Bhakti, of good immigrant, bad immigrant, blah, blah, blah. So they're very clearly telling you that there is space for a very particular type of person here. And the media has completely bought into it because they have the exact same type of people working for them. They are elite institutions.
This sudden allegiance, I'm just hung up on this word because it's such a good word, sudden allegiance to the law. you know all we have seen in the last 15, 16 months of genocide in Palestine, violation after violation, and the media will refuse to say anything illegal happened. We have Benjamin Netanyahu hanging out with Trump, a war criminal with an arrest warrant on his head. Stuff is happening. Nobody wants to quote the law. But oh, when it comes to refugees, this is illegal, this is illegal, this is allowed, this is not allowed. Suddenly you are a lawyer? Give me a break.
I think one of the things I want to kind of cite is also how, when the war in Ukraine started and Ukrainian refugees were leaving, I just want to quickly cite some of the things that journalists said. This guy called Charlie Diagata from CBS, reporter in Kiev, said, Ukrainians are European. They are civilized. Unlike Iraq or Afghanistan, that seems conflict raging for decades. I'm like, this is just that they were just so aghast that white people could be refugees. And the other one, they have the ITV journalist in Poland said, the unthinkable has happened. And she says, Ukraine is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe. And you have this kind of reporting go on and on and on. And again, you realize that this is not something new, and there's a long history. There's an essay that really talks about how initially, when it's about how the media got the Balkan Wars wrong, and it's as if like the same thing keeps repeating over and over again. They say how initially, when people were reporting the Balkan Wars, because this was in the heart of Europe, US editors or just in general editors didn't want you to cover a refugee crisis or violence in the heart of Europe. And I'm just like, what? And this is an essay that's written by actually speaking to all of these war reporters in the heart of Europe. But finally, I just want to give one last example of the complicity. So, the Washington Post, which had just weeks before granting the decision for Ukrainians to have asylum, characterizes the whole process of giving Ukrainians asylum heartening. Okay. And then at the same time, calls the Biden administration's leniency towards Haitian refugees has led many or most Haitians towards the border. So imagine the absolute cruelty. Exact same time, the Washington Post calls the Biden administration decisions to grant Ukrainian refugees asylum heartening, and chides the Biden administration all around the same time for simply allowing. Again, the Biden administration was not being lenient to the Haitians. Let's be very clear, nobody is lenient to the Haitians. That is where we are.
And this reminds me very quickly, of course, of Clinton, where the ex-Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, genocide, okay, in some forms, and then Rwanda, and then who got to come, right, to the US? Who got the papers? Who was facilitated? Who was allowed? I mean, the anti-blackness. I mean, just forget about it. Out of
Yeah.
control. At the time, of course, the debates were always about intervention. Who should intervene, etc., etc. But what happens after war ends too? After the stuff, the rage of it dies down. Where do people go? Where do displaced people go? And you know that the white ones did much better in Europe and in the US compared to the Rwandans and Ugandans and all the folks that were displaced in that particular area.
Well, we're also seeing the same thing sort of play out again now with Palestinian refugees and Afghan refugees. And I remember Canada was a big side of this when Ukrainian refugees started coming in by the truckload. There was all of these very benevolent narratives, and they were accepted into the country and given as royal treatment as one could possibly have as a refugee. And it was great because that should have been the template for everyone. And this, of course, came at the expense of Afghan refugees waiting in line. And do we think the US is going to open its doors to Palestinian refugees? Absolutely not. Anyway, the next time you see something about a good immigrant or a bad immigrant or a good refugee or a bad refugee or anything that calls a migrant detention, calls cages migrant detention facilities, remember, it's not you, it's the media.